I would argue that in South African national parks, 80% plus of its revenue is from tourism. If tourism did not exist, the national parks in their current state would not exist. And I think, although the funding of, say, the Great Barrier Reef, the conservation in Australia is different, I would say it's similar. Part of what drives Australian society and societies around the world to conserve these areas is the tourist attraction and the revenue that brings in for broader society. So that's why we're interested in that link.
In the case of Galapagos, where you have like 25,000 people living there, is also like a mixed blessing, like I said. But one of the things people are doing now, which is illegal in some of the islands, is shark finning. They go, they kill the shark, they take the fins, and they sell those fins. Now it's tough to control that, and it's almost impossible because it's almost like a mafia, kind of a dark doing this. But if you don't give people an alternative like tourism, it's difficult to think what else they would do. I mean, these people are not going to leave the island. I don't think there's been any serious thought of removing all the population from the island. There has been, like in the 50s, people were talking like this, but now it's impossible almost for political reasons. So you have to provide alternatives, which the only real one that I can think of is some well-managed tourism. So I think for me it's more a matter of how you manage tourism and how you lower some of these impacts than whether you want to have tourism or not.
In Queensland, tourism is one of our biggest industries. I mean, obviously we have coal and other things, but tourism is one of the biggest generators of income for the Queensland economy and the Australian economy.
And just following on that, I had the fun of facilitating the tourism industry with 6 government ministers and the Premier. And they're the decision-making body in Queensland, by the way, for all land matters. The government current policy is to make national parks more accessible to tourism operations, and as Duan said, removing red tape. So it's going to be, they're going to facilitate greater use of the protected area estate for tourism. So that's a reality.
You mentioned government policy. Most of what you guys are doing is hard, pretty hard science, basic work, implications. Do any of you have good stories or horror stories, let's say, where basically what you're doing is research and it's almost like an ivory tower? I'm concerned about the link between the research, the results, and how much of that is going to have a significant effect on government policy, on decision making. Anyone?
Answer that, or?
Here we can all.
I mean, I think that's a good point. Martina works officially for South African National Parks. That's a policy management agency. So the very presence means that, you know, when I was working for South African National Parks, the research we do in projects like this feeds directly into what that organization does. And we're looking to develop those sorts of partnerships elsewhere as well on the other sites on this project. But that's critical, and that's why we have this applied focus as well. We're not interested in only asking esoteric academic questions.
I think, yeah, again, in the case of Galapagos, that's a very relevant and good question, because like probably most of you know, that Galapagos has been, most of the science done until the 50s or the 60s was basic evolutionary science. So it was people looking at how evolution works, what are the implications of an island into the evolution. But in the 70s and the 80s, that started to change, and more now research is done in issues that are relevant for people and the environment, and which have had policy implications. We always try to involve the national park in many of the things, and we are always working closely with them. We have an agreement with them. So yeah, I think we as academics, we have the obligation almost to be working in issues that are also relevant for managers and for not only for managers, but also for the people living either inside the park or close to the park.
Why I introduced the change of government that we just had in Queensland and their change in policy is that up until this year, the policy of national parks, or the principle of national parks was of management, is if you keep people out, you don't have any problems. Now, that wave has finally hit. The economic imperative has hit. The government's changed its policy. I suspect what we're talking about will be, give us 6 months and I think we'll be greeted with open arms trying to find the problem. find the issues and solutions. So engaging park managers in the past was impossible. I think it'll change very quickly.
I think the National Park Service is highly politicized, and the policies vary with the particular regime that is making the laws. The Park Service talks about working under a continuing dilemma, the dilemma to make these resources available as well as to protect them into the future. And the people who are working in the parks, just from my observation of them, seem to be on the latter, preserving for the future, whereas the political will is about access to the parks.
One of the core issues that we are looking at as part of this project, we're looking at the biophysical aspects of climate change and how that will impact on tourism, and how that in the long run will impact on the communities, and how that will inform government policy and adaptive management strategies for governments, government managers, tourism operators, and basically communities that are impacted by changing facilities within the parks. So it has actually quite a lot of policy focus, but that will come down the track as we come up with what's happening and the recommendations later in the project, and how we can influence policy and legislation and management.
Carlos?
I was a bit surprised that you don't have an economist. I'm an ecologist, so I do not really work with my own but I was surprised because it seems that behavioral economics have to be absolutely crucial for what you're doing. You have to measure externalities of tourism. You have to measure all these interactions. So that's
we do actually have an economist. We haven't brought him in yet because we're not at the measurement stage.
there was a little mention of economics.
David Odland, who worked with us on the America the Beautiful project, the willingness to pay, will be working with us on this project as well. So you're right. You have to be able to find out what people are willing to pay and kind of how the market functions when things change.
Yeah, I was just surprised.
Yeah.
Probably have time for one more question. Dave?
I think all of you mentioned just briefly, or not more extensively, invasive species. I've been working in New Zealand here a good deal recently, where they have like 2,500 native species and 30,000 invasive species. It's overrun with invasive species. And I think all of the sites that you're working with will be overrun eventually too. It comes down to controlling invasive species. How we control invasive species. They could be, you know, a possum from Australia, or it could be a Phytophthora fungus from elsewhere in the Pacific. You know, these things have to be controlled if we're going to protect these places.
My response to that, there may be different ones, is that, and I mean the literature on invasive species and invasive ecology is also reflecting this, is that's it's a social value that we place on these species and saying indigenous species are better than invasive species, and in some we're going to have to make trade-offs, and in some ecosystems we're going to have to say, look, this Galapagos, for example, is so unique, we've got to do everything we can to keep them out. Other ecosystems we might have to be, and it will be through participatory processes with managers, with stakeholders, might be, well, actually it's going to cost us so many million to keep this out, and we're going to have to focus on other things.
So it's an economic decision.
Well, it's a value decision as well. It's what do we value in the system as a society, and what are we willing to pay to try and maintain that value, and what do invasive species
If we spend the money
threaten
there,
that?
we can't spend it over there. You know, we'll have to make choices.
Can I just make another comment? For my sins, I'm on this wonderful government committee called the Horse in National Parks Committee. Australians don't like horses in their national parks, but we've been given some money to do some research, not me, but for the group. And we just want to raise the myths that get associated with invasive species and introductions. Everyone said the horses bring in weeds. Well, we brushed down, well I didn't, they brushed down horses and did all sorts of tricks about collecting the seeds of horses. And what came out of their droppings, I can't get away from shit, can I? And then they took the ranger's car and took from under its chassis what was there, and it was 1,000 times worse than the horse. So there's a lot of myths or preconceptions now, and I think that's important of some research, that we get rid of those things and introduce species. There's some that we thought on Fraser Island we couldn't get rid of. Volunteers have actually got rid of a large proportion of some of the weeds there. New Zealand's another kettle of fish though. Islands might be able to do some specific things. Mainland seems to be a real problem.
Well, thank you very much to all